Good afternoon, students, and welcome to today's lecture on the earliest days of civilization in what we call the Holy Land. Now, the Holy Land is situated in the Eastern Mediterranean, and it's been a cradle of civilizations and a center of religious significance for thousands of years. Now, during the Bronze Age, from around 3000 BC to around 1200 BC, this region witnessed the rise and fall of numerous cultures and the development of a diverse belief system that set the stage for three of the world's most influential religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So journey with me as we explore the social, political, and religious aspects of the Holy Land during this period, shedding light on the fascinating tapestry of civilizations that flourished within its borders. Okay, so let's start by getting our geographical and chronological bearings here, right? In this course, we're going to focus on what I call the Holy Land, a region bordering the Eastern Mediterranean that encompasses modern-day Israel and Palestine, parts of Jordan and Lebanon and Syria. But despite its small size, this is an incredibly diverse set of landscapes, from fertile plains to rugged mountains, and this region as a whole has been incredibly important throughout history. Let's take a minute here, though, and focus on terminology. I know that's not the most fun, but it's important here. So we just heard, right, that this land is made up of modern countries of Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, right? Quite a diverse place. But it is the modern country of Israel, or what the Hebrews would call Eretz Israel, or land of Israel, that is really going to serve as the focus for much of this course. Now, the modern country of Israel, though, was only formed less than 100 years ago. It was only in 1948. But the Israeli people, or the Israelites, go back thousands of years, all the way to the end of the Bronze Age. Now, Israel is a Jewish nation state, but part of that nation state is occupied by Muslims, whose families have lived in the area going back long before the creation of the modern country of Israel in 1948. And we call this group of Muslims living in these areas Palestinians. And the word Palestine is an alternative term for the area that covers modern Israel, between the Jordanian Valley and the Mediterranean Sea. Deciding whether to call the region Israel or Palestine today can actually be quite a loaded decision, with religious and cultural and political baggage. Now, actually, the word Palestine, right? A little bit of historical, factual info here, right? It comes from the ancient group of Philistines who settled in the area during the late Bronze Age, more than 3,000 years ago. You might actually know one of these Philistines, the famed Goliath from the story of David and Goliath. So anyway, that's where the name Palestine or Palestinian comes from. You'll also hear this area called the Levant. Now, this is originally a French term for the same area that we've been talking about, and it translates as rising, because this was the east for the French, right, compared to France, and that's where the sun rises. It's often used because it's a less politically loaded term than some of the others. And yet others will call the region Canaan. Now, this is a term that's used in the Bible, and it refers to, again, the same area we've been talking about so far. Now, in the Bible, the land of Canaan is known as the land of milk and honey, right? It's the promised land for the Israelites. For archaeologists, the Canaanites were the earliest group that settled down in small villages and hilltop forts in this area. And it's from the group of the Canaanites that we get all the diverse tribes later on, right? Tribes like the Israelites, the tribe of Judah, the Ammonites, the Amorites, the Edomites, the Moabites, all the ites, right, that we read about in biblical literature, they all derive from or descend from the Canaanites. So the term Canaan refers to the land or region, and the term Canaanites refers to the people who lived in the area during the Bronze Age, again, from around 3000 BC to around 1200 BC. And it's likely that all these other diverse groups, including the Israelites, emerged out of the Canaanites. So, for the purposes of this course, we'll call the general area the Holy Land, because it's the home of such influential religions and because it doesn't prioritize any one religion over the other. And in this particular class, today's class, we'll also refer to it as Canaan because of its connection with the Canaanites, right? The earliest settlers in permanent villages in the area. Okay, now that we've got a sense for where we are geographically and terminologically, let's talk chronology, or time periods. So the time period we're talking about today is called the Bronze Age, and it lasts again from around 3000 BC to around 1200 BC. And guess why they call it the Bronze Age? Well, you don't need to have a PhD in archaeology to guess that it's the time period where people in this area invented bronze. And archaeologists are just not the most creative people sometimes. Anyway, the Bronze Age is often associated with the rise of civilization and social complexity. So let me put this in perspective, right? So we know from fossilized skeletons that anatomically modern humans date back to around 200 or 300,000 years ago. And what that means is that for 95% of our existence, we were nomads. We wandered the earth in search of food and a dry cave to sleep in, and maybe a nice caveman or cave woman to sleep with. And that's basically what we did for 95% of our existence. And we'll call that period the Paleolithic, or the Old Stone Age for the most part. Then around 10,000 BC, some people started to settle down in one place. They started farming, they started raising livestock, they started building permanent houses. And this was a big, big change. So big, in fact, that we call it the Neolithic Revolution. But even though some people roamed the land and some lived in small villages, there wasn't that much differentiation. Wherever you were living, everybody in that little village had about the same amount of stuff, the same size house, the same amount of goods and resources, really living a pretty similar life to one another. Well, that all changed at the start of the Bronze Age. So around 3000 BC, or about 5,000 years ago, this is when things start to get really, really different. We get large cities with tens of thousands of people. We get economic stratification, with some people having much, much more than others. We get political and social and religious hierarchies, right? With kings and priests, an elite group of aristocrats ruling over the regular farmers and laborers. We get sophisticated art, right? Things like sculptures and painted ceramics and wall paintings. And we get the emergence of the world's first writing, right? Cuneiform in the Near East and hieroglyphics in Egypt. In short, this was an incredibly exciting time. And it is at the beginning of this period, the early Bronze Age, that our story of the Holy Land begins. Now, according to the Bible, the land of Canaan was seen as the Promised Land, the land where the Hebrews could settle down and worship their one God in peace. But before the Hebrews, right, the tribes of Israel and of Judah, ever made an appearance in historical records, Canaan was full of a diverse group of cultures that we collectively call the Canaanites. So Canaanite society was organized into city-states, each with its own ruler and governing structure. These city-states served as centers for political and economic and cultural life. They were characterized by impressive urban planning. They had strong fortified walls and architectural wonders such as temples and palaces and public buildings. So think of these as like little hilltop fortresses that would have protected a small center around houses and temples and public buildings, that sort of thing, and then also controlled the surrounding area around it. But each of these fortresses was the center of an independent city-state. So Hatzor and Gezer and Jericho and Byblos, these would have all perhaps like kind of shared a culture and a style, but they would have been politically independent. Now, one of the most famous cities of the Bronze Age was Jericho. And you might know of this from the much later kind of biblical story, right? Where the Hebrews have finally made it to the Promised Land, aka Canaan. And they see the mighty walls of the pagan city of Jericho still standing in their path. And according to the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, the Israelites were to march around the city once a day for 6 days, and each time they have 7 priests carrying 7 trumpets or made of ram's horns. And on the 7th day, they're to march around the city 7 times, and when Joshua gave the signal, the Israelites were to let out a huge shout. And when this happened, the walls of the city miraculously came tumbling down. The Israelites rushed in and conquered the city, destroying everything within it. Now, we don't have concrete archaeological evidence for this specific event, but we do have evidence for the city of Jericho, right? It was a thriving town, especially in the early days of the Bronze Age. And it did have massive fortification walls that date back all the way to that very, very early period. Here's the problem, though. These massive fortification walls, well, they were built thousands of years before the kind of Joshua, if he did exist, ever existed and never would have gone marching by. And in fact, they were built so far earlier that by the time Joshua shows up, the walls of Jericho were already in ruins, right? Jericho was not a fortified town at that period. In fact, the walls had been tumbled down for centuries by that point. And it's this type of thing that makes you kind of question the historical validity, or makes you think, what should we think about the historical nature of the Bible? You get the sense that it is inspired by some real things, right? Jericho was a city, it did have walls, but maybe that it's not accurate in every sort of historical sense, right? It wasn't still standing when Joshua would have been walking by. And this makes sense when you think about kind of when the Bible was written, right? So it starts getting written down in the 7th century, 6th century BC. It's written over the course of another 5 centuries. And so the guy writing about Joshua would have been writing about something that would have been happening hundreds of years, maybe 1,000 years earlier. And so it makes sense that he doesn't know the exact chronology of the city that he's talking about here. So we'll talk a little bit more about the validity of the Bible in terms of its historical nature as we continue on in this course. So, speaking of resources, the Canaanites were renowned for their skilled craftsmanship and trade networks. They excelled in the production of luxury goods, including intricate metalwork and jewelry and pottery and textiles. And their craftsmanship was highly sought after, contributing to their economic prosperity and establishing Canaan as a major trade hub. So you can find that stuff in places like Egypt. Canaanite art, especially their pottery and figurines, reflected their religious beliefs and daily life. And intricate designs and symbols adorned their pottery. They depicted scenes from their mythologies and their rituals and their daily activities. And these sculptures and figurines also represented deities, right? Their gods, as well as animals and human figures, really quite a wide range of things, all of which provide insights into Canaanite aesthetics and religious iconography. Now, socially, Canaanite society was structured hierarchically, with a ruling elite class and a laboring class. The ruling elite enjoyed wealth and power and privileges, while the majority of the population engaged in agriculture and trade and craftsmanship. And that agriculture focused on what we call the Mediterranean triad: wheat and grapes and olives, right? For making bread and wine and olive oil, a classic Mediterranean diet. They developed sophisticated irrigation systems, and they terraced the land around them to maximize productivity in their fertile coastal plains and in the hilly terrain surrounding it. And so in Canaan, in the Bronze Age Holy Land, we get a rise of complex societies and a diverse geographic and cultural landscape. And so when you think about the Canaanites, I want you to think, about 3000 to 1200 BC, small fortified hilltop city-states, all of which sort of share a culture, right, and a religion and maybe a language, but all of which are politically independent, which often leads to conflict between these city-states. So when we think of the Holy Land in the Bronze Age, we want to think of the land of Canaan, inhabited by Canaanites. The Canaanites weren't just one people, however. They were a diverse set of cultural groups inhabiting different regions of the broader Holy Land. They all settled down, they all farmed, they all traded, they all created art and architecture in cities. And in addition to all that, they all worshiped their gods. Now, religious practices in Bronze Age Canaan were diverse and centered around a polytheistic belief system. That is, the Canaanites worshipped many gods and goddesses associated with various aspects of life and nature and fertility. Their religious rituals and practices played a central role in their society, and it was really kind of entwined with their daily lives. This wasn't something you just did once a week, this was a daily sort of thing. Now, one prominent deity in Canaanite religion was Baal, or Baal, the storm god associated with rain and fertility and agricultural abundance. Now, Baal was believed to bring vital rainfall and ensure a successful harvest. And Canaanites performed rituals, including sacrifices and prayers, to seek Baal's favor and help ensure that agricultural prosperity, right? It makes sense. They give something to Baal, he gives them a productive harvest in return. Another significant goddess in Canaanite religion was Asherah, the mother goddess associated with love and fertility and motherhood. Now, Asherah was often depicted as a sacred pole or a tree, and her worship involved rituals and offerings conducted at sacred groves or shrines. Now, archaeological excavations have uncovered evidence of religious structures and artifacts in Bronze Age Canaan, providing insight into their religious practices. So, for example, at the site of Ugarit in modern-day Syria, tablets were discovered containing hymns and prayers dedicated to various deities, offering a kind of glimpse into the religious rituals and beliefs of the Canaanites. The worship of the gods and goddesses extended beyond formal religious settings and into domestic and personal life. Remember, this is a really kind of daily religion intertwined with everyday life. And the Canaanites would have had household shrines or altars where they would have offered prayers and sacrifices to their preferred deities. And we find lots of these small little figurines representing gods and goddesses in houses, right? Domestic contexts, suggesting that individuals may have been engaged in kind of a personal worship and seeking divine protection or prosperity from within their households. Now, overall, religious practices in Bronze Age Canaan were deeply ingrained in the fabric of society, in the worship of various deities, in the performance of rituals, and the belief that these kind of supernatural entities could somehow impact their daily life. And when we think about Canaanite religion, right, we want to think of this as a polytheistic sort of religion with the gods associated with natural phenomena, right? Things like rainfall or childbirth or fertility, that sort of thing. In much the same way that we see in early Greek religion or Roman religion as well. Now, the trajectory of civilization wasn't just one straight rise to the top. Instead, around 1200 BC, things started to fall apart, all across the Mediterranean and the Near East, including the Holy Land. By this point in the Bronze Age, the cultures of the Holy Land, everyone from the Canaanites to the Hittites up in modern-day Turkey to the Egyptians in the Nile River Valley and beyond, they'd all been flourishing for centuries. But soon, a series of catastrophic events would change the arc of history. So over the course of about 100 years, from around 1200 BC to around 1100 BC, the kind of large city-states that we talked about in the Holy Land, and even the burgeoning empires of the Hittites to the north and the Egyptians to the south, well, they were nearly destroyed. And this isn't a metaphor. We can actually see layers of burning at some of the biggest Bronze Age sites, places like Hatzor and Megiddo. Megiddo, that gives its name to Armageddon from the Bible, just to name a few. Now, for a while, scholars thought this was due to a diverse group of naval marauders that they called the Sea Peoples. And this is because that's what the Egyptians call them. That gives us our historical textual source for them. And they called these invaders right around the same time, this group of 9 different groups, maybe more, coming together and wreaking havoc in the region. But while external invasion may have played a role, it can't quite explain everything that happened, especially at sites much further inland. Nowadays, scholars think that external invasion from groups like the Sea Peoples were part of the equation, but the totality of causes was far more varied. Some instances of collapse can be attributed to internal conflicts and rivalries among Canaanite city-states themselves. Political power struggles, competition for resources, and territorial disputes could have resulted in violent confrontations, leading to the downfall of cities and their fortifications. Additionally, natural disasters may have played a role in the destruction of Canaanite sites. So things like earthquakes and floods and other environmental catastrophes could have caused structural collapses and widespread damage to cities, leaving them vulnerable to subsequent invasions or internal unrest. This all could have disrupted trade networks, which then became far smaller and less reliant on these major cities, creating a sort of vicious cycle and sending the region into further decline. Now, these Bronze Age invaders, or the Sea Peoples, they actually leave a lasting impact on the Holy Land as well. So the Egyptians note one of these groups is known as the PAH, and that they settle in actually the southwestern part of the Holy Land. And PAH, this relates to the word Philistine, right? So it's actually the same kind of word, just said in a different sort of language. And so when we look at the Philistines, which eventually become the Palestinians, right? We're going all the way back to this group of Sea Peoples that the Egyptians call the PAH. Now, the Bronze Age destruction of Canaanite sites had a profound impact on the region's history and cultural development. So many of the cities were abandoned or left in ruins, and the subsequent Iron Age witnessed the rise of new powers and the emergence of new cultural and political entities in the region. It marked a significant transition in the trajectory of Canaanite civilization, and it paved the way for the rise of subsequent kingdoms. All the Ite kingdoms we talked about, right? The Amorites, Ammonites, Edomites, Moabites, as well as the Philistines, they all arise shortly during or after this period of Mediterranean chaos. Oh, and so did the Israelites, as we'll see in the lectures to come. Okay, so the Holy Land during the Bronze Age was a dynamic and multifaceted region, marked by diverse cultures, religious beliefs, and intricate social systems. The dominant group at the time was known as the Canaanites in the land of Canaan, which we associate now with kind of the modern Holy Land. And this group eventually gave rise to future cultural groups that are going to play an integral role in our story. This era laid the foundation for future developments that left an indelible mark on the cultural and religious history of the world. And it set the stage, as we'll see, for some of the world's most powerful religions.